Queen Victoria's hemophilia came from nowhere. That sentence has been printed in more than 400 books, repeated in 10,000 academic papers, and have become the foundation of how we understand both her medical history and the royal succession. And for nearly 200 years, it was incomplete. The mutation appeared in 1819 in London at Kensington Palace. Victoria's father was 50 years old. Her mother was 31. The record of her birth sits in the baptismal register of the cupola room, a physical document preserved, dated, witnessed. But there's a question that document does not answer, and there are people who spend decades asking it anyway. The stakes are more than historical. When a genetic disease appears without explanation, it invites speculation. When that disease carries a dynastic weight, when it will reshape the health of every major royal house in Europe, the absence of explanation becomes dangerous. Rumors form. Historians who should know better begin to wonder. And a young woman becomes a scandal waiting to be excavated. But here is what happened when the science caught up with the speculation. Here is what geneticists found when they began to ask not whether Victoria's father was who the record said he was, but instead asked something more technical and infinitely more revealing. What mechanism in biology could explain the sudden appearance of a disease that had never before existed in the royal line? The answer lies in a principle so precise, so measurable, that it eliminates entire categories of speculation at once. And when you understand this principle, the legitimate historical questions that remain become even clearer. Not because the answers are simple, but because the science is very, very strong. Keep that distinction in mind. It will matter. Stay with this. Queen Victoria became the longest reigning British monarch of her era. She ascended the throne in 1837, at 18 years of age, and her reign lasted until 1901. She married her cousin Prince Albert, bore 9 children, and her descendants married into every major royal house in Europe. She is remembered as a grandmother of Europe, the embodiment of imperial stability, the woman whose lineage would shape the continent for generations. The story of her birth fits neatly into this narrative. She was the daughter of Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathern, 4th son of King George III, and his wife Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Edward married late, at 50 years old. Unusual for a prince, but not impossible. The marriage was deliberate, politically motivated, designed to secure the succession. Victoria became pregnant almost immediately. She gave birth to a daughter on the 24th of May in 1819. The child was christened Alexandrina Victoria in the cupola room on the 24th of June, 1819. The registers exist. Witnesses signed. The story seemed closed. But something unexpected emerged. Victoria's son Leopold developed a bleeding disorder. It was severe, life-threatening, and completely absent from the royal family in the generation before. Her daughters began to show symptoms. Her grandsons, the children of her daughters through marriages to princes across Europe, many of them struggled with the same condition. The bleeding disease that had never appeared before was now appearing everywhere, carried to the maternal line, spreading across the genealogies of Spain, Russia, Germany, and Austria. Historians of medicine began to call it the royal disease. Doctors knew it as hemophilia B, a genetic condition of the blood's inability to clot properly. For a very long time, the appearance of hemophilia in Victoria's line seemed to suggest only one uncomfortable possibility. If the disease was not in Edward, Duke of Kent, then perhaps Edward was not Victoria's biological father. Perhaps the father was someone else entirely. A man named Sir John Conroy emerged as the speculation's focal point. He was her mother's secretary, her mother's confidant, possibly her mother's lover. The court gossiped. Historians wondered. A theory took shape. Not documented, not proven, but intellectually coherent. If not Edward, then Conroy. The theory was wrong. But it would take geneticists more than a century and a half to explain why. The first scientist to seriously examine Victoria's genetic inheritance was not searching for her at all. By the 1990s, geneticists were beginning to understand the mechanisms of inherited bleeding disorders. They had mapped genes. They had isolated mutations. They were learning which changes in the DNA sequence produce which symptoms in which genetic lineages. It was routine laboratory work, the slow accumulation of case studies, when someone noticed that the oldest known case of hemophilia B in the royal family was Victoria. Not her sons, not her grandsons. Her, The woman herself, the carrier, the source. One researcher in particular began to examine not the mythology of Victoria's birth, but the mechanism of her mutation. The question shifted. Instead of asking, was Victoria actually Edward's daughter, the question became, could mutation of this type arise de novo? That is, could it appear for first time in Victoria without having been inherited from either parent? The answer was yes. And then a more technical question. What conditions would make this outcome not just possible, but actually likely? That is when the science became precise. X-linked hemophilia B mutations, the researchers learned, arise more frequently in children of advanced paternal age. The mechanism is straightforward. As a man ages, the cells in his testes that produce sperm divide more times. Each division is an opportunity for error. DNA polymerase, the enzyme that copies genetic material, makes mistakes occasionally. Most mistakes are caught and corrected, but some slip through. The older the father, the greater the number of divisions, the greater the probability of spontaneous mutation in the sperm. Spontaneous mutations account for approximately 30% of all hemophilia B cases in the modern population. Prince Edward was 50 years old when he fathered Victoria. The statistical likelihood of a spontaneous mutation at that age was not zero. It was measurable. It was predictable. It was, in fact, exactly what mathematical models would predict to see in the offspring of a man of that age and reproductive status. No DNA test was needed, no verification beyond what the records already contained. The principle of advanced paternal age mutational origin was sufficient to eliminate the entire Conroy theory, not through absence of evidence, but through evidence of mechanism. The bleeding disease in Victoria was not a mark of illegitimacy. It was a mark of biology. It was a mark of time. The mechanisms of mutation became the first evidence track. The second would come from the archive itself. When historian Catherine Hudson began examining the life of Sir John Conroy in detail, a task she undertook during the 1990s as part of a broader study of Victorian household politics, she expected to find gossip. She found more than that. She found documentary evidence that contradicted the affair theory entirely. The Duchess of Kent, Victoria's mother, was seen constantly in public during the months when Victoria would have been conceived. The court records, the journal entries, the letters that survive show her conducting business, appearing at events, maintaining a household that left almost no opportunity for extended private contact with Conroy during the critical window of conception. More significantly, Conroy himself was not even in England during part of the period in question. His movements are documented. His responsibilities are listed. The timeline does not fit the narrative that had been constructed around him. Hudson discovered something else. The widespread belief that Victoria and her mother caught Conroy and the Duchess in some familiarities, a story that had been repeated by the Duke of Wellington himself, rested on a single anecdote told decades after the alleged event, by someone who was not present, and whose source claimed to have heard from someone else who had heard it from someone else. It was hearsay of hearsay. When examined closely, the original account had been disputed even by Victoria herself, who stated that her mother's piety would prevent any such behavior. The historical record, when actually read carefully rather than inherited uncritically, suggested that the rumor had taken on a life independent of evidence. The gossip had been documented. Yes, documented gossip is still gossip. What emerged in the archival work was a picture of Conroy as a man whose political ambitions and household influence had made him resented by the royal family and the court. Victoria herself despised him, but resentment and ambition are not paternity. The archive did not eliminate suspicion through the absence of incriminating evidence. The archive suggested that the suspicion itself had been constructed, layer by layer, by people with reasons to believe what they wanted to believe. Two separate evidence tracks, one genetic, one historical, were beginning to converge. This is where the two tracks meet. The genetic evidence says that Victoria's hemophilia B would almost certainly have been a spontaneous mutation arising from her father's advanced age. The mutation rate for such conditions in men over 50 is not rare. It is predicted by mathematical models. It is what we would expect to see. There is nothing about the appearance of the disease that requires alternative parentage. The biology alone, without any other evidence, is sufficient to explain the phenomenon. The historical evidence says that the theory of Conroy as Victoria's biological father rests on gossip, circumstantial timing, court resentment, and a series of anecdotes told second and third hand by people who were not present when the alleged events occurred. When the claims are examined against the documentary record, against letters, household accounts, movements documented in real time, they do not hold. There is no contemporary evidence of an affair. There is no timeline that fits. There is only rumor. Neither the geneticist nor the historian knew about the other's work when they began. Both arrived at roughly the same conclusion through entirely different routes. The speculation about Victoria's parentage was not based on evidence that survived scrutiny. It was based on speculation that had been mistaken for evidence. And yet, there is something that remains. A living community carries this history. Victoria's descendants include millions of people today. Some of them carry the hemophilia gene that traces back to her line. Some carry the family knowledge of what the disease has meant across generations. The fear of bleeds, the loss of sons in childhood, the medical interventions that became possible only in the late 20th century. The question of Victoria's parentage is not merely historical. It still matters to people whose family trees show them as descended from one of the most famous women in history. It matters because identity, whether genetic or ancestral, does not stop being personal just because it becomes public. So the science is clear. The archive is clear. But for some descendants of Victoria, the emotional weight of uncertainty did not entirely vanish with the evidence. And that, too, is worth understanding. History is not only what can be proven, history is also what people have believed and what those beliefs have meant to their understanding of who they are. The speculation about Victoria's parentage did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a system of succession pressure, court politics, hereditary anxiety, and a particular moment in British history when the future of the monarchy seemed genuinely uncertain. In 1817, Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only legitimate grandchild of King George III, died in childbirth. She was 21 years old. Her stillborn son died with her. The succession crisis that followed set off what historians have called the Hyman's War terrific, a desperate race among the aging sons of George III to marry and produce heirs before their elder brothers did. Time was running out. George III himself was aging. His eldest son, the Prince Regent, had proven unable to produce a legitimate heir with his estranged wife. Something had to happen. Something had to give. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, was 50 years old. He had spent decades in military service. He had no legitimate children. He had accumulated enormous debts. He married Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld primarily because the marriage contract came with parliamentary increase to his income, an increase that the marriage was supposed to secure. Within months, Victoria was pregnant. Within a year, she had given birth to a daughter who would eventually become the most powerful woman in the world. In this context, in a system built on succession anxiety, on the desperate mathematics of who could father an heir, and when it was perhaps inevitable that when an unexpected genetic phenomenon appeared in the next generation, people would reach for explanations that fit the structure of scandal and illegitimacy. Because in a system where legitimacy determines everything, where a single question mark over parentage could theoretically unmake a reign, the appearance of any mystery invites suspicion. The Conroy speculation was not unique. It was one version of a pattern that repeats throughout history. A genetic phenomenon appears that science cannot yet explain. People construct narratives. Those narratives align with existing social anxieties. The gossip becomes history. The history becomes something believed. This pattern is not exclusive to the British royal family. Every culture, every lineage that carries genetic disease has produced similar moments. It is called the blame narrative. The impulse to place moral or sexual transgression at the center of an explanation when biological explanation is not yet available. The impulse is human, but it is also a system. It is a structure of how societies understand inheritance, responsibility, and the body itself. And Victoria's case, for all its prominence and privilege, is actually a common story told in an uncommon setting. So we return to the register, the baptismal register of the cupola room. Alexandrina Victoria, christened 24th of June, 1819, 205 years ago. The document sits in the archive. The names are written. The witnesses signed. And what remains is not the resolution of all questions, but rather the clarity of which questions actually matter and which were only ever projections. Victoria was Edward's daughter. The science has made this clear. The archive has made this clear. The speculation was not justified by evidence, though it was understandable as a product of the historical moment in which it emerged. We can understand the conditions that created the suspicion without granting the suspicion authority. But there is something else that remains. There is the question of what it means to carry a genetic anomaly that no one you descend from carried before you. There is the question of what it means to be Victoria, knowing that your body was the site of a spontaneous mutation, one of those rare biological moments when a man of 50's aging reproductive cells produced something new, something that had never appeared in your lineage before, something that would reshape the health of royal families across a continent for generations to come. Victoria did not ask for this. She did not consent to becoming the vector through which hemophilia would travel across Europe. She simply existed at the moment when biological chance intersected with historical circumstance. She became, in effect, a meeting point, and from that meeting point, something unprecedented flowed into history. Her legacy is not diminished by knowing that she carried a genetic mutation. The contribution she made, the political innovations, the cultural influence, the reshaping of what a woman could be in a position of power, those things remain hers. She was a person, not a medical data point. But she was also, like every person, a being whose body carried its own inherited and accidental history. Some of it she chose. Most of it, like all of us, she simply received. The register remains. The documents remain. The questions that remain are not about paternity. They are about what we ask of the dead when we have a chance to know something about them, and what that knowledge costs us, and what we owe to the millions of people alive today who carry the consequence of Victoria's body, Victoria's age, Victoria's genetic fate. The answer sits not in the archive alone, nor in the sign alone, but in the space between them, in the clarity of what can be proven, and in the humility of what remains a question we simply cannot and never will fully answer.